The wind had been screaming for 2 long days. It wasn't a normal storm. It was a wild, endless roar that stripped the Wyoming plains bare and drove the snow into tall, shifting walls of white. The whole world outside Silas Ward's cabin had vanished. All that was left was the 4 log walls, a fire that barely held its own against the cold, and the thing-hostly whine of the blizzard pressing at the windows. Silas sat at his rough-hewn table, oiling the trigger of an old Winchester rifle. Each click echoed in the small cabin, the sound of a man keeping himself alive by doing something familiar. His face was hard, carved by wind and grief. The storm didn't bother him anymore. Nothing did. 3 years alone in this place had turned him into part of the wilderness itself. He hadn't always lived this way. Once there had been laughter in the cabin, soft footsteps, a woman's humming. But that ended the day he buried his wife Sarah on the ridge behind the cabin. Since then he'd built his life out of silence and routine. The wind could scream itself horsaro outside. It wouldn't touch him. That's why when the sound came he froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the wood creaking. It was Akenak. Soft, weak, barely there, butte real. He stared at the door, his hand still resting on the oiled rifle. No one came out this far. Not in summer, not in winter. Any traveler would have frozen miles before reaching his land. The sound came again, a dragging, scraping thud against the oak. Silas stood slowly, every instinct telling him to stay still, to let the storm take care of whoever was out there. He hesitated, then crossed the room, his boots creaking on the wood floor. His fingers brushed the handle of the knife at his belt. He lifted the latch. The moment the door cracked open, the storm exploded inside. A wall of wind and white fury slammed into him, scattering the ash from the hearth and blowing the lamp nearly out. Through the blindings now, something fell forward, small, heavy, and lifeless. It hit the floor with a dull thud. Not a person. Oh, really? Just a frozen bundle of rags and snow. Silas grabbed the door, forcing it shut against the screaming wind. The room fell back into dim orange light. His breath came in slow, heavy clouds. Ash stared at the shape on his floor. Heck knelt down. The figure didn't move. He reached forward and pushed back the hood stiff with ice and froze again. It was a woman. Her skin was gray-blue, her lips cracked, her lashes crusted with ice. She looked dead. Damn it, Silas muttered, not in pity but frustration. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't want this, but something old in him. A voice that sounded a little like Sarah's wouldn't let him turn away. Hez lit his arms under her. She weighed nothing. Like a sack of dry sticks, he carried her to the fire and laid her down on the worn fur rug. Her clothes were frozen solid, torn from travel, and her hands, God, her hands were black at the fingertips, raw and stiff. He moved quickly. He fetched his bottle of whiskey, uncorked it, and pressed it to her lips. Drink, he said roughly. A little spilled, but some went down. She cooed, a sound like sandpaper scraping wood. Her eyes fluttered open. Dark, distant, lost. My name, she whispered. Hush, he said. Don't need a name. He set the bottle down and fetched warm water from the kettle. Heck knew what had to be done. The frozen clothes would kill her faster than the cold outside. His hands worked fast, pulling at the stiff, torn fabric, not gently, but not cruelly either. Her body was thin, bruised, marked by old pain, not the kind that came from weather or hard work, but from something uglier. She flinched when his rough fingers brushed her arm. Her eyes darted open, but she didn't fight. She was too weak. Silas threw one of Sarah's old quilts over her, the one that smelled faintly of cedar, and years gone by. He looked away, his jaw tightening. Then he sat back on his cot, staring at her, trying to make sense of what fate had just thrown at his door. She lay there by the fire, her breathing shallow but steady. The sound filled the cabin, small and fragile, like a bird's heartbeat. When she woke again, it was daylight. The storm still raged outside, but the fire was strong. She blinked, confused. Herman floating between dream and memory. She saw him first, the man sitting in the chair across the room cleaning his rifle. He was large, broad-shouldered, with a dark beard that looked weeks old and eyes cold as steel. She tried to sit up. Pain exploded through her body. She gasped and fell back. He didn't move. You're safe from the storm, he said quietly. His voice was low, hoarse, Anusto speaking. Safe from the storm, but not from him. He ladled broth from the pot over the fire, poured it into a tin cup and walked over. Drink, he said, crouching. She hesitated. His hands were scarred, the skin thick and split from years of labor. She thought he might strike her if she refused. When she didn't move, his voice turned harder. Drink or die makes no matter to me. Her hunger won over her fear. She reached out, her bandaged hands trembling. The cup burned her palms, but The heat of the broth was life itself. She drank. When the last drop was gone, he took the cup and set it down beside the fire. His eyes studied her. Not kind, not cruel, just measuring. "Who are you?" he asked. "Anna," she whispered. "Anna Smith," quote. It was a lee, but it was all she could manage. He frowned, his gaze drifting to her bare hand. "No ring, no mark of one, no husband," he said flatly. "And you didn't walk from the south. The wind's been west all week. You came from the east." Her heart stopped. He was right, he knew she was lying. She pulled the quilt tighter, the fear rising in her chest again. He grunted and stood. "Rest," he said. "You're no good, half dead." Then he turned his back and sat again by the fire, cleaning his rifle. The storm howled. The fire popped. And in the dim light of that lonely cabin, two broken souls, one running from the world, one hiding from it, breathed the same air for the first time. Neither of them knew it yet. But the blizzard outside was nothing compared to the one that had just begun inside those four wooden walls. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of cold that seeps through every crack in a cabin wall. Silas had been up since before dawn, chopping wood outside, each swing of the axe steady and rhythmic. He wasn't thinking. Rarely did anymore. He just worked until the numbness replaced thought. Inside, Anna sat close to the fire, wrapped in that old quilt. Her hair was still damp from the melted snow. She'd found her boots near the door, stiff and ruined, and a pair of women's shoes beside them, clean, small, and far too old to belong to her. They were Sarah's. Something in her chest tightened when she realized that someone had lived here once. Loved here once. She could feel it in the little things. The neat stitching on the curtains. The worn rocking chair by the window. The flowers carved into the table's edge. When Silas stepped back inside, bringing the icy air with him, she looked up quickly. He dropped the firewood near the stove and said, "You'll need to eat again soon." She nodded, her voice still too weak to answer. He poured her some porridge and set it down beside her without meeting her eyes. Then he sat at the table and began repairing a broken bridle strap. The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the faint creak of leather and the crackle of the fire. Finally, she spoke. "You live here alone." Quote. He didn't look up. 3 winters now. Why? "Because the land's mine," he said simply. "And because I've got no reason to leave." She studied his face, the lines, the scars, the distance in his eyes. There was pain buried there, deep, quiet pain. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she said softly. He grunted. "No one ever is." She turned her face toward the fire. Her throat tightened. "They were chasing me." His hands paused. "Who?" She didn't answer right away. The words felt like knives. "Men from a ranch south of here. I worked there for board." "The owner." He wasn't kind. Silas's jaw twitched. "And you ran?" She nodded into the storm. "I didn't care if I lived or not. I just couldn't stay." The silence stretched again. Then in a loud voice, Silas said, "No one deserves that." It wasn't comfort. It wasn't sympathy, but it was truth. And something in his tone made her trust him, if only a little. By nightfall, the storm had calmed. The wind still howled, but now it was distant, fading. The cabin felt smaller in the quiet. Anna sat near the fire, sewing a tear in her sleeve with thread she'd found in a box near the window. Silas watched from across the room, his chair tilted back, boots resting on the table. "You sew?" he said quietly. "My mama taught me before she passed." He nodded. "Sarah used to sew curtains mostly." She glanced at him. "Your wife?" He hesitated, then nodded once, buried up on the ridge. "I'm sorry." He looked into the fire, his eyes unreadable. "So am I." For the first time in years, Silas spoke of her, of the accident, the horse that bolted, the winter night that took more than just a woman. Anna listened, not with pity, but with understanding. Loss was something she knew well. Hours passed, and the night grew heavy around them. The logs in the hearth cracked softly. She rose, clutching the quilt to her chest. "I can sleep on the floor," she murmured. He shook his head. "Take the cot. It's warmer by the fire. And you, I'll be fine." But when she hesitated, I said, "Take it." His voice wasn't angry, just final. She lay down, exhaustion, pulling her under almost instantly. Silas sat by the window, staring out at the white world beyond the glass. He told himself he didn't care who she was or what she'd done. Come morning, she'd be gone. But morning brought something else. He woke to the sound of footsteps. Light, careful steps near the door. He reached for his rifle, but before he could move, she spoke. "I wasn't trying to steal." His hand froze. She stood by the table, her finger hovering over a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, her eyes filled with shame. I thought you were still asleep. I didn't want to bother you. I just can't take being trapped here anymore. Her voice broke on the last word. He looked at her, really looked at her. The fear in her eyes wasn't of him. Not anymore. It was of the world outside, of the pain waiting beyond the ridge. You step out that door, he said quietly. And you won't make it a mile. The drifts will swallow you whole. I'll take my chances. He stood slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. You won't survive. Quote. Her hands trembled as she clutched the bread. Better than staying where I'm not wanted. He took a deep breath. The words hit harder than he expected. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then something shifted in his eyes. Something almost human again. Anna, he said. It was the first time he'd spoken her name aloud. I didn't say you weren't wanted. She froze. He stepped closer, his voice low, rough, but steady. You think I'd have carried you in from this now if I didn't care whether you lived or died? Her breath caught. Then why? Because I don't know how to care anymore, he said. I forgot how. The air between them grew heavy. The firelight flickered across his face, showing the battle raging inside him, the need to stay hard, and the part of him that still remembered what warmth felt like, and his eyes filled with tears. You don't have to remember, you just have to try. He stared at her for a long, painful moment. Then, slowly, he reached out just an inch and brushed his calloused fingers against her hand. It was the smallest touch, but to both of them it felt like a spark in a frozen world. Outside, the storm began to fade into silence, and inside that lonely cabin, two hearts that had forgotten how to feel began to beat again. The days that followed passed slow and quiet. The snow still lay deep over the land, but the storm had broken, leaving behind a strange calm. The sky was pale blue, the kind that almost hurt to look at after so many gray days. Smoke curled from Silas's chimney, rising into the frozen air like a fragile thread between heaven and earth. Inside the cabin, life began to take shape again. Anna cleaned, mended, and cooked. Silas worked outside, fixing fences, tending to the half-starved cattle that had survived the storm. Neither spoke much, but something in the silence had changed. It wasn't the emptiness it used to be. It was peace. One evening, as the sun dipped, behind the white hills, Anna stood by the window, her hands resting on the sill. It's beautiful, she whispered. Silas looked up from his workbench. What is, quote, the world after the storm, she said. It's so quiet, like it's waiting to start again. He nodded slowly. That's the best time to plant, right after the ground's been broken. Their eyes met for a heartbeat too long and both looked away. She went back to stirring the stew over the fire and he sat down across from her. The air between them was thick with the things neither dared to say. Later that night, when the fire had burned low, she found herself awake, listening to the sound of his breathing. It was steady, deep, a sound that felt safe. Her own heartbeat was not. It was faster, heavier, full of thoughts she didn't understand. She turned to look at him. The firelight painted his face in golden shadow, softened the lines time had carved there. He looked younger like that, almost gentle. Her throat tightened. Silas, she whispered. Hess stirred but didn't open his eyes. What is it? Quote, I had a dream, she said softly, that I was back at the ranch, that I couldn't escape. His eyes opened now, dark and alert. You're safe here. I know, she said. But the dream felt real. I could still feel his hands. I can still hear his voice. He sat up slowly. You don't have to talk about it. I do, she whispered, because if I don't, it'll never leave me. The fire cracked, filling the space where her words trembled. She told him everything about the man who owned her, about the nights she tried to run, about the things he did when she didn't move fast enough. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. Silas didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He just listened. His jaw tightening, his eyes burning with something fierce and cold. When she finished, her shoulders were trembling. He stood and walked to the door. For a moment, she thought he might leave, but instead he pulled the iron latch closed tight, then turned back toward her. "You're not going back there," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not ever." "I wasn't planning to." He stepped closer, the firelight catching the scars on High's hands. "If they come here, if anyone comes here, I'll take care of it." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "You do that for me?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You remind me of who I was before I stopped feeling." Her breath caught. "And who was that?" "A man worth saving." Tears welled in her eyes. She took a shaky step toward him. The distance between them was nothing now. The warmth of the fire reached their faces, but the heat between them was stronger. "Silas," she whispered, "please, I can't take it anymore." He froze. The sound of those words, so soft, so broken, cut through him deeper than any wound. For years, he had built walls of silence and cold around his heart. But in that moment, those walls cracked. He didn't move at first, didn't breathe. Then he did the one thing he never thought he'd do again. He reached for someone. He pulled her into his arms. Not roughly, not like a man claiming something, but like a man finally letting go of everything that had kept him numb. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing until the sound faded into quiet. He rested his chin on her hair, eyes closed. "You're safe now," he said again, but this time his voice trembled. "And so am I." Quote, the fire burned low, painting their shadows on the wall like ghosts finally finding rest. Outside, the wind had died completely, and the first stars of spring blinked above the horizon. Days later, when the thaw began, Anna stood with Silas at the ridge behind the cabin. The snow had melted enough to reveal the wooden cross where Sarah lay. Anna knelt and laid a small bunch of prairie flowers there. "She must have loved you very much," she said softly. Silas nodded. "She did, and she'd have wanted me to live again." Anna looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. "Then live." He reached down and helped her to her feet. Together, they walked back toward the cabin, hand in hand. For the first time in years, Silas didn't dread the morning. The land would bloom again. The ranch would breathe again, and the man who had once lived only in silence had finally found something worth holding on to. As they reached the porch, he turned to her and said quietly, "Welcome home, Anna." Her smile came slow, but it was real. "Feels like one." Quote, the wind carried their ladder across the wide Wyoming plains, soft and warm against the fading snow. And somewhere deep inside, the frozen heart of a broken rancher began to beat.